the idea du jour of the day is.
Yeah, well,
just
this
how
is
much
something
time's
that,
been lost.
So I've been partnering with the Daily Wire for about a year and a half so far, and that's been very successful. They've been a pleasure to work with. But what they wrestle with constantly, all of the principles at Daily Wire would rather in some real way be concentrating on philosophical, theological, or dramatic matters. So which is partly why the Daily Wire is turning towards entertainment for kids, but also for adults, starting to make movies, for example, and TV shows. They'd rather be doing that. I had Ben Shapiro. He participated in this seminar on Exodus that I produced with about 9 other extraordinarily interesting thinkers. And Ben just shone, he's wasted. Is he wasted on the political? The political's necessary. But it's one nation under God for a reason, because the political isn't the pinnacle. Never. It's never the pinnacle. And if you're capable of discourse at the pinnacle, political discourse is secondary.
Well, there's also,
and it's also evanescent, right?
There's ways that it can tumble as well. There's, how would you say, degrees of depth of political stuff too, because what works on YouTube a lot of the time is reacts to insane woke TikToks
exactly,
or does whatever.
Exactly. And it's easy to get pigeonholed that way. Yeah. Yeah. And is it a waste? It's non-optimal.
But it's an interesting question to be asked, right? About how much sort of ankle or skirt or need you need to show from an algorithmic perspective in order to keep the numbers churning, because ultimately you're producing what people click on. You don't want to be completely beholden to your audience. That's audience capture.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to be so unaware of having your finger on the pulse of what is trendy that you become obscure and obsolete.
Right. Well,
and
that
this balance.
Well, in that line that you're trying to walk when you're dealing with matters that are the highest and also making them publicly accessible, that's a very, very tight line to walk. I mean, Jonathan Pageau has done a good job of that, although his market is still relatively niche, and he certainly is more esoteric, let's say, than the Daily Wire guys who tend to devolve into the political, and that devolves into the cheap political from time to time, right? The hit for hit's sake, or the chasing the algorithm. And I mean, that's the danger that all politicians have too, is that, and I've seen this with lots of political types who have developed a persona. This is particularly true in the United States, I would say, because Americans are so salesman-y. And I don't say that dismissively. It's really hard to sell, to market, to communicate. I saw the Elvis movie recently, and I thought it did a beautiful job of laying this out, because Elvis was a stellar talent. But his manager, who was a real shyster, was also a stellar talent. Like, Elvis wouldn't have been who he was without his corrupt manager. And it's sort of a deal with the devil, but you have to give the devil his due too. And the salesman-y part of American culture can easily devolve into a kind of narcissistic manipulativeness. That's where it would go if it becomes pathological. But as you said, you have to be aware of your audience, and you have to be delivering what there's a market for. And it's very difficult to get those things right.
This is a question that I've got about your new book coming out next year. I haven't seen any of it. And it sounds like, based on what you're reading at the moment, you're trying to grapple with religious texts, especially the Bible. We Who Wrestle with God is the name of the book.
We Who Wrestle with God, which is that's what the word Israel means. Israel means we who wrestle with God. And so, it's very interesting, because it means the chosen people are the people who wrestle with God. And you might say, well, who wrestles with God? And the answer to that is, well, everyone wrestles with God. Well, why? Because you can't act without making moral decisions. Like, every step forward is predicated on a moral decision. And so we're all wrestling with God.
Is God a moral decision?
God is the spirit that guides you when you make the proper moral decisions. So I wouldn't say God is a moral decision. He's the spirit of moral decision. That's actually not a bad definition. Like, part of what I'm trying to do with this book is to point out that a lot of what's happening in the biblical corpus is actually definitional, right? Well, modern people think the fundamental issue is, do you believe in God? But that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is, what do you mean by God? And so let me give you an example of this that will make it clearer. So there's a medieval idea that God is the summum bonum, which means the sum of all that's good, or the essence of all that's good. Okay, you might say, well, I don't believe in that. Now remember, this is a definition of God, right? God is the sum of all that's good. Okay, all right, so you don't believe in that. All right, let's take that apart. Do you believe that some things are better than other things? Well, people will say yes. Okay, so then you believe that there is a scale of good. Okay, is there something that all things that are good share in common? And the answer to that has to be yes, because otherwise you don't have a conception of good, right? The word good implies that across good things there's some essence. Okay, well, the definition, one medieval definition of God is the essence of good. Well, okay, let's say you don't believe in that. Okay, does that mean you don't believe in anything that's good? Okay, then how do you act then? Because to act means to do something that's better than what you're doing now, right? There's no action without movement towards the good. And well, you might say, well, I don't believe that there's a unitary good. Okay, you believe there's a fractionated good. Well, then what do you do when those things oppose one another, right? Which would be in a conflict of duty. What do you refer to to help you adjudicate between different goods? Well, generally what you do is, if you could pursue A, which is good, or B, which is good, and they conflict, then you pick the higher good. Okay, do you believe in a higher good? Well, if you don't, you can't decide between goods, which means you're paralyzed. If you do believe in the higher good, then do you believe in the highest good? Well, the highest good is God. What do you mean by that? By definition. Okay, so now you have a definition. Now, then the next question might be, well, what's your relationship with the highest good? And you might say, well, I don't have a relationship. It's like, well, actually you do, because you act in relationship to it. You can't help it. One of the interesting things about the biblical corpus is that it's based on the insistence that you have a relationship with being and becoming, a relationship, like a personal relationship.
When you say biblical corpus, do you mean the collection of texts that makes up the Bible?
Yeah, because it's a library of books, essentially, right? Okay. The Bible is actually the first library of books. It's written by a very large number of different people and aggregated over thousands of years, and then sequenced into a narrative, interestingly enough, because no one really sequenced it. Or by no one, I mean no individual person. It was the endeavor of the collective, or the spirit that possessed the collective over thousands of years. But the narrative is coherent, which is really quite something. And so the narrative is an investigation, number one, into the nature of God, number two, into the nature of relationship with God, and then number three, into the nature of the proper relationship with God, all of those things. And God is the sum of all that's good. So the Bible is an analysis of the human relationship with the good.
What would have to happen after the publishing of We Who Wrestle with God for you to look back on that publication and consider it a success? What is it that you want to happen? What do you want people to feel or to take away from that work?
I think we're at the beginning of the counter-enlightenment. The propositions, the Enlightenment view of man is wrong. And this, out of the Enlightenment view came science. But the science now indicates that the Enlightenment view of man is wrong.
What do you mean?
Well, the Enlightenment types believed that we could orient ourselves in the world, let's say empirically, and this is Sam Harris's proposition, you can abide by the facts. You can orient yourself as a consequence of the dispassionate analysis of the facts. You can't. And I would say the artificial intelligence engineers have figured that out. The postmodern literary critics have figured that out. The psychologists and physiologists of perception have figured it out. And the neuroscientists have figured that out. So it's not just the evidence that that view is necessarily incorrect, is overwhelming and multidimensional. You can't orient yourself by the facts. Why? Because there are as many facts as there are things. In fact, if you combine things, the nature of the combination is also a fact. So there's as many facts as there are things and combinations of things. Well, you can't orient yourself by that. You drown in chaos. It's like you're standing in the desert and there's an infinite number of directions you could go. Well, how do you choose a direction?
And that's showing up in that most recent survey that I just mentioned. People feeling meaninglessness, purposelessness.
Right.
I'm overwhelmed.
They're lost in the desert.
Yep.
They're lost in the desert. And the desert is the desert of facts. It's dead facts.
Especially given how few people can agree on, is this a fact or is this counterfact?
Well, that's also a problem, is that it's not like the facts are necessarily self-evident.